All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking over Python servers. Specifically today, we're going to be utilizing the Flask framework. So what we'll be covering during part one will be what is a server, what is Flask. We'll do a quick review over the full stack workflow, installing Flask, creating a Flask server, collecting data, building an API view, and creating our API endpoint. From there, we'll move on into part two, where we'll connect our server to our database utilizing Flask-SQLAlchemy. We'll then utilize psycopg to work as an interpreter for our Python code to turn into SQL queries and actually run SQL queries into the database to grab information. We'll go over how to connect the actual database with our Flask application, how to create a model, and writing SQL queries in Python. Does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? Good. If there aren't any questions, please refer all of your questions into the X-Ray questions channel or raise your hand. Even if I don't attend to it immediately, I will attend to your question during the appropriate times. So let's get right into it. First thing to talk about is what is a server. So, and I'm actually going to cover pretty much all three of these all together. So far, we've talked about our front-end HTML. We covered that on Friday. Yesterday, we covered our database, and we discovered that our database runs on port 5432 within our machine. All right, so we could already see that things are starting to extend. None of these are necessarily connected yet. And today, we're going to work on developing our actual backend server that will communicate to our database. So we don't know what port our backend is running just yet, but once our backend is running, we're actually going to need to create a connection between our backend server, the port that it's currently located at, and how to talk to port 5432 in order to find our database. Now, our backend server is essentially something that's going to receive a request from our front end, grab information from the database. It's then going to format it in the format that we want to receive it for our front end. It's going to make sure that the data is valid. It's going to prevent any sort of attacks to our database, like a SQL insertion into the database input, to ensure that all of our data isn't corrupted and that it's clean when it gets processed and sent back to our front end. Now, we're going to be utilizing Django later on. And Django has a lot of, I think the term used is Django comes with batteries included, as in it has most of the tools and utilities that you think you may need. The people who developed Django, they said, oh, well, typically everybody needs this in order to get their project set up and ready to go. So rather than having people build it from scratch, let's give them that tool already built for them, which is a great thing about Django, especially when you're first learning this information. But today specifically, we're going to be talking about Flask. Flask is quite literally the opposite of Django. It comes with 0 to no batteries included. Even though it is extremely simple to build a Flask application and get it running, it's very bare bones. The application is running, but it has no way to handle any sort of cross-origin request. It doesn't handle serializing your data. It doesn't handle how to create models or how is it that it's supposed to interact with your database. It has no built-in functionality to be able to find your database. All of that you have to manually input into your application to ensure that it works together. Now, a perfect example of this dynamic here, which we're going to be working on today, of our backend and our database, is going to be the Poke API. I know at this point we're probably tired of seeing this example, but I personally love this API. Every time you click on submit, this is my front end, right? When I click on submit, this is going to a server. And I know it's going to a server because of that end here. It's saying API. We'll be talking about RESTful API conventions later on, But know that when there is a difference between HTTPS PokeAPI.co, which is where I'm currently located, there's nothing after that. That's just rendering their front-end application. All right, at this exact web URL, all that's being rendered is an HTML template that has some sort of JavaScript script that's calling whatever framework they're using and rendering all of the content that's being compiled by that framework. So all I have here is just HTML with a bunch of JavaScript sitting inside of it. But the moment you start making requests to API/v2, well, that gets processed by a different server. All right, at this point, a different server is receiving this request, and it's going to a specific endpoint or some sort of function. And the way that our server is able to find that function is by the naming convention of Pokemon. The moment we have Pokemon, it follows the path and it says, hey, this is the endpoint. This is where the endpoint stops. So what function am I supposed to trigger? We have some internal mapping saying this is the function that you're going to call every time the endpoint ends here and with these exact character sets. All right, so it says that this is the character set that I'm looking for. This is the function that matches, but this function can take in a parameter. Okay, well, where do we get the parameter from? That's my last argument there, right? Ditto would be my parameter. I am sending a request with the parameter of ditto. Ditto gets passed into the function. The function then makes a SQL query to the database saying, hey, I want all of the information regarding ditto, right? And we saw that yesterday. That looks like this. It says select all from, and then we have ditto. So that SQL query then gets processed. It comes back with some information. But what I see here on the front end is a JSON response. Well, yesterday when we ran a SQL query, we didn't get back a JSON response. Instead, we got back a data table. So that table comes back to our backend framework, and it comes back as a special data set called a query set. And what the backend framework does is it iterates through each one of those query sets and formats them to generate this information, which is essentially a dictionary of lists and nested dictionaries within it. Once all of that gets processed by our server, it then gets returned to our JavaScript template. And then JavaScript grabs and making a strong assumption here as to how it's working. So please don't take my word for it. Likely what's going on is that JavaScript script, once it receives that information, it grabs this block by ID and changes the content within it. All right, so if I were to type in Charizard now and submit, you'll see that the web page didn't reload. This was updated. This was updated. And the content of this block was also updated. So likely what's happening there, oh no, there you go. So likely what's happening there is the script that they have working here is grabbing this element by ID and updating it to match the URL up above. It's grabbing this element. I'm not sure if it's by ID or class, but it's changing this to match this parameter. It also depends on what sort of framework they're using. This could be some sort of variable that when it's changed, it updates the web page. But when that response comes back, that's when all of our JSON data gets updated, gets changed for the new content that came back from the database. That's kind of the full stack lifecycle. So far, we've seen HTML and CSS. We haven't talked about how JavaScript talks to our backend framework, but this is a pretty good example of saying, hey, this data is not coming from some magical place. It's being sent. We're sending a request to the backend. The backend is then sending a SQL query to our database. Our database returns the information to our backend. Our backend formats that information to be in JSON and then returns it to the front-end framework. All right. That's a quick overview over what we have so far. Does anyone have any questions over the content I just covered? Okay, great. If there are any questions, then let's get going with some code. So I'm just going to do a quick project overview here. All of these files are empty except for data CSV. Data CSV is still holding the same 5 students that we had yesterday. I have an init.py. That's to mark that this is the very root of my Python project. I have this models.py that's currently empty. That's where I'll be placing in my models, or in other words, my data tables. We've just covered the README. My server, this is going to hold the actual Flask server. And then I have utilities.py, which is where I'm going to hold different functions. All right. So there's my project overview. Let's actually get into writing some code, starting off with our server. So now I want to write some code, and this code is going to be pretty specific. All I want to do is I want my user to, just like the Poke API, whenever they go to a certain URL, I want them to receive the information of these 5 students within the data.csv. So let's write that down in some pseudocode. So I want to create an endpoint that returns all students with all their data. All right. So there's our mission, right? That's what we're trying to accomplish before the end of the lecture. Now, how could I do that? Before we even start talking about collecting data from the database, let's say that I didn't know about databases and I was handling all of my data through a CSV file. How could I grab all the information out of the CSV file and create a function that will return a list of dictionaries where each dictionary would be representing a student? Go for it, Momo.
Okay, we can create a function or give it name load data.
Right.
Okay, this function, yeah, you wanna be class
Sorry, could you
right?
say? Sorry.
Class function.
This isn't going to be a class, no.
It will not be a class function.
This is not a class, no. We're not working with
Okay.
anything within OOP as of right now. This is just a function.
Okay. So we start reading the file CSV that including the data. We will use file CSV with open
Right.
the relative path. No, with open, relative path and the read only the new line and as CSV file. And then we gonna import the module CSV to use the function dictreader. So we can import this data as a dictionary and put it inside the reader.
All right. So
Dictreader and CSV file. And then next step, we're gonna iterate over this data for row in reader. We can print it or whatever you want to do. Yeah, and then we let me. Okay, we gonna create a dictionary or list to append this data in. Yeah, student list. And then it will be student list dot append dot.
All right.
And return it.
Perfect. What am I returning?
The student list.
All right, perfect. So there you go. We have a function named file that will take in a file path. It will then iterate through this file, create a dictionary for each row, and then append it to a list. It will then finally return said list. This is great. Now, not yesterday, I apologize. On Friday, we spoke about how important it is to isolate behavior, such as your CSS and your HTML. Well, the same thing applies when you're working with Python modules or when you're working with code in general, right? This is a utility. This is not part of my server. This is something that my server is going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and take this code here. I'm going to put it within my utilities file. All right, so there's my utilities file. I'm going to go over to my server, and I'm going to say from utilities, import, load data. I'm going to say data, or just going to call it student data, is equal to load data, and the path is data.csv. Finally, I'm going to print student data. So now when I run Python server.py, we get a list of dictionaries where each dictionary is representing one student. All right. Again, here's my utilities. That's where I have my load data function utilizing the CSV dict reader. That is then getting imported into my server. We are loading the data, and we are simply printing it into the terminal as of right now. Perfect. Does anyone have any questions over what we've done so far? Go for it, Brandon.
Could you go to utilities real quick?
Of course.
Was the blue squiggly just your spell checker?
It is, yes.
Okay.
All right, great. So there we go. We have our function that's able to return this information, all right? But now I said here that I want to create an endpoint that returns all the student data. So I have a function that can load the data, but I need a function that is in charge of returning this data in a very specific format, right? So now before we get into that, let's go ahead and start mutating our script so far. So currently right now, all we have is a Python script. How do I turn it into a server, right? How do I turn it into something that I can interact with on the internet? Well, we're going to utilize Flask to do so. So currently you'll see that I'm within my default environment. I'm going to go ahead and start installing Flask. And this is pretty simple. It's just going to be pip install capital F Flask. Again, it is pip install capital F Flask. I'm going to be sending that here in the X-ray questions as well, just in case anyone's missing it. All right, so there we can see the Flask has been successfully installed. Now let's turn this into an actual server. All right. I'm going to go ahead and come to the very top of my page. I'm going to say from Flask, all lowercase, I want to import Flask. Great. So there you go. Now I have Flask in my system and I have it accessible within my server script. Now, there is something really specific that I notice about the way this is spelled. The very first letter is a capital letter. What does that tell me?
Class.
Awesome, yeah. Flask is a class. So how do I need to instantiate or initiate that class, right, with our init method. So I need to create an instance of that class. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say, I want my app to be a Flask app. And for now, I'm just going to name it server. All right, so here's my app. I have an app that's running. I'm naming it server so that it's able to run. Okay, well, how do I actually make it run? Well, if I come down below, I'm going to run app.run. And I'm going to leave the rest as our default values for now, before we start going into them. Okay, so app.run, what does that method mean? Let me open it up here. I'm going to utilize command and click on that run command so that we can take a look. All right, so it tells me this runs the application on a local server. Do not use run in a production setting. It is not intended to meet security and performance requirements. Okay, good. So this is very explicitly telling me, hey, this is only for local development. If you want to utilize this, or if this application is getting deployed, you need a separate server to be able to communicate with Flask to run this. Okay, good. So I know that so far. That's important to annotate. I should only utilize this for local development. Perfect. Then we have the debug attribute. It's telling me there that will let me know if I want it in true, it will actually give me the errors that are happening. If I place it as in false, we're just going to get a blank internet page. There you go. Okay. And it gives me a pretty in-depth description about everything. But here's one of the most important ones that I want to make sure that we know here. So here we have our host. Now the host parameter, this is typically set to 000 to have the server available externally as well. It also defaults to 127.0.0.1. We talked about this specific series of numbers before. What is this representing? Right, Gary?
That's your own machine, your local server.
Yeah, so this is running in my own machine. The port that it's running on, we can see that it's defaults to port 5000. Great, so now I know back in my image over here as to my computer and where everything's running, I can come over and say, hey, my backend will likely be running in port 5000 by default. Great. Awesome. There's a couple of other parameters that are available. We're not going to go into all of them. These are the important ones that we need to know for the lecture of today. All right. So let's go back to my server. I know that it has some default values and that it's running. Now, there's a little bit more that we have to discuss when it comes to ports. On Macs specifically, and yeah, this is for pretty much all Mac users. You need to know that there is a security or a background service that's already running within your machine in port 5000. So if you try to run Flask with the default settings on port 5000, you're going to get an error. Or it's going to tell you that it successfully ran, but then when you go to the port, the communication is going to be blocked. So rather than utilizing port 5000, we're going to specify that the port we want to use is port 8000. All right, well, how do I do that? I'm going to come here to my app.run, and I'm just going to simply say, I want you to run on port 8000. Now, the other thing that we have to talk about is debug, right? I want to make sure that I'm able to see any errors in my application, or that I'm getting some sort of message telling me, hey, there's an error in my application. So I need to include that I want debug to be equal to true. I want you to tell me when there's something wrong, and I want you to run my application on port 8000. All right. So far we installed Flask into our machine. We import it into our server script. We then create an instance of the Flask class, save it under the variable app. And now we're running a class method of run that will create a server or a server on my local host that will have debug messages and will be running on port 8000. All right. Now let's take a look at what happens when I run Python server. Oh, hello. That's not what I meant for you to do. Let's close that. Server. Interesting. There you go. Python server.py. I probably have some sort of misspelling. All right. So I'm running it, and now it's not just executing a script. It's occupying my entire terminal, and it's giving me quite a bit of messages. So here we go. We're serving a Flask app. The name of this app is server. We can see server up above. That's what's being ran. Great. It's not caring about student data because we're never calling it or using it. It's telling me that the debug mode is on. That's good to know because I did tell it that I needed it to be true. And then it says, hey, this is a development server. Do not use this in production. So it's telling me yet again, this is not for production. Okay, that's fine. Now it's telling me that currently we're running on HTTP 127.0.01 on port 8000. Good. Well, let's open that up. So here's port 8000. It's running now. Again, our debugger is active and it's giving me a debugger pin. All right, this debugger pin, we're not going to go too much into it. If we get really in-depth issues that it can't share, or we decide something should be hidden, we would need this pin to be able to access those error logs. But now that I have this 127.0.0.1 at port 8000, you'll see that we have this not found H1 template, and it's coming in with the requested URL was not found on the server. If you enter the URL manually, please check your spelling and try again. All right, so this is just saying, hey, you don't have anything to respond at this current location. Nothing can answer, right? It followed this path. It was an empty path, and it's saying, I don't have a function to trigger. I can't respond or say hello or anything. We can see that the server was able to receive a request. It's telling me the time the request was received, what kind of request it was. It was a GET request sent over HTTP, and it returned a response of 404 not found. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the information that we just covered? Go ahead, Polly.
Can you explain the reason for changing the port from 5,000 to 8,000? What was the reason behind it?
Yes, Macs have a separate service that's running on the background on port 5000. So if you try to run a Flask application on the newer Macs, they usually interrupt with that port and they have issues as far as communication. Does that answer your question, Paula?
Yes.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, perfect. Well, currently it's saying that it's not found. So let's make something that will respond. We're going to create an API view that will respond to this information, all right, or to this request. I'm going to go ahead and make a function here. I'm going to name this function, say, hello. And all it's going to do is it's going to return an H1 element that says, hello, oh, X-ray Platoon. I almost called you guys whiskey again. All right, so there's my function. And I want this function to be rendered every time this web page gets loaded. All right, I want it to be my home page. This is what I wanted to return at 127.0.0.1. So let me go ahead and place that there, right? So there's where my response should be going. So now I'm going to refresh this, but nothing happened, right? Nothing changed. Well, I did create a function and it is returning a string, but this function, as far as Flask knows, there's nothing connecting it to this function. It's just there. It's existing and that's it. Well, how do I connect it? This is where our decorators come in and our entire lecture about decorators comes into play. Before, we had a decorator that worked with getters and setters. Well, we're going to apply a decorator that will create a route. So I'm going to say apt. I'm going to call my class app. And the decorator that I want to use is route. And let's take a look at route real quick. So this is a setup method, right? It's working as a decorator. And what it's looking for is the rule, which is a string. And it gives us a small example of what we're looking for. All right, so here you go. What we're looking for here is I want to create a route at the index. So this is an empty path. There's no following information after that closing slash. And all it's going to do is return hello. That's great. This is really good to know. Now I can come back to my server and add it to my class. Hey, this is a slash. Good. I'm done here. You'll notice that because I had a syntax error, my server stopped running. So I'm going to run my server one more time. So there's my server running. I have my application. It has a specific route at which it's supposed to respond to. Well, what happens when I refresh my web page now? Well, when I refresh my web page now, I get hello X-ray showing up on my browser. And that is happening because my function of say hello is being triggered. This is now an API view. Right? I am receiving an API request at HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8000. Because there is only a closing slash, it matches this function say hello, triggers it, and returns the H1 element hello X-ray over to HTML. And if I take a look and inspect here, I don't want to get into the whole network tab just yet. We'll go over that later on. But we can see that my body is just rendering the response. All right, Eric, go ahead.
So for the app.route and then the /, if you had, so I'm tracking it triggers say hello, but if you had numerous functions that you would want to trigger, would you have multiple app.route and then like the search parameter, or is that handled a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to be covering that here shortly, right after this question block.
All right, thanks.
Of course. Any other questions? Go for it, Gary.
Why do we add the slash in there again?
This slash here?
Yes, in the app route.
Yeah, so as you can see here, we have HTTP 127.0.0.1 at colon at port 8000, right? So that's everything that my host is rendering. When you travel to this site on, oh man, it's not showing it. When you travel to the site on a browser, even though it doesn't show it to you, the browser is appending a slash at the very end.
Right.
So now this slash is the path that, or the route that our Flask application is looking for to send a response for. So it's looking for the slash, it matches it here at app route and returns this function as the response.
Got it.
All right. I don't see anything in X-ray questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward here. All right, so we have this information. We have our app route. Everything's working great, but it's not necessarily doing the purpose that we wanted it to do, right? I want to create an endpoint that returns all the students with their data. I have all of the student data, but I don't have a function that will return this information just yet. So let's create that function. I'm going to say def get students. This is not going to take in any parameters. So there you can see that it's sending back students. And now I want to return this list of dictionaries. So return student data. All right. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and add an app route here. And this app route is just going to say students. All right. So this, when I go to HTTP 127, and let me just copy that here, at port 8000 /students/, that's going to respond with this app route down below. It's going to grab the data from our CSV file and return that data. Let's try it out. I'm gonna run my server. If I go to hello X-ray, that still runs normally. Great. Now let's go to slash students. Well, now when I go to slash students, I am getting back a response, which is a list of dictionaries. Now let's take a look at our inspect tab here one more time. So here we have a div class, which is a JSON formatter. Where is that coming from? And then I have a pre-tag that's showing me all of this information. Why didn't specify any of this? And you may think, oh, this is likely coming from Flask itself. Well, it's not, right? Flask isn't providing this for us, unfortunately. It would be awesome if it was. But what's actually providing all of this information for us is our browser, Google Chrome. If you're on a separate browser, you're likely getting a different looking response than what I have here. It's still probably containing all of this content, but it's not giving you the option to have this pretty print, and it's likely looking different as far as your HTML elements. It all depends on the browser that you're using. So this is important to note, but why is it important, right? Why does this matter? Well, right now I'm just sending back code. That's all it knows about. It's not reading it as actual JSON data. Well, if I take a look here, it's not wrong. All I'm sending back is a list of dictionaries. I never turned it into a JSON data. Although it is in JSON format, it has not been JSONified. So that brings us into our next import. I'm going to bring in JSONify, which is a function. And all I'm going to do is pass in JSONify into my student data. All right, I'm going to load it one more time. And now when I send my request, I still get the same response within my browser, and it may look the same, but the difference comes in this response as it was sent. There is now a response header, and I apologize to everybody. I'm going to have to show this way. Let's see. Nope, it is within the network tab. I see, Brandon, you have a question? You could go ahead and
You gotta reload the page for it to show up in network, I'm pretty sure.
I did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's not showing me.
Maybe preserve log to the left.
To the left. It could be it.
That
Nope.
did something different.
All right, I'll have to get back to everybody on this portion here. What JSONify is doing is it's changing our headers to, rather than just being a block of code, it's actually sending back application/JSON, which is what most front-end frameworks are expecting in order to work with it through JavaScript. All right. So now we created a function that's able to grab all of our student data from data.csv, return a response at a specific route. Now, how exactly is this different from just having an HTML template, right? Or something that will render this information? Well, if I open up a separate tool here on my VS Code called Thunder Client, you could install this through your extensions. If you go over to extensions and type in Thunder Client, it will populate. This is what I'm referencing to, and I'm gonna get this link here, hopefully. Let's see. Now pass it over in our chat. Well, what Thunder Client allows me to do is it allows me to send requests to APIs. So there we can see that I am sending a request to 127.0.0.1 at port 8000. and the response it's sending back is hello, X-ray Platoon. Well, we know that's coming from our server at a slash, all right? And if I go to students and I then send that request, it's now grabbing all of the students and rendering them in my response body. And actually, this might be a better way to show it here. Body type, that ain't it. Here we go. So now we can see the content type of this response is coming back in application/JSON. All right. Awesome. Now we have a Flask server running. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the information we've covered so far? Go ahead, Daniel.
I'm not sure if you specified, but is there a reason why we return student data as JSONify, or are we gonna get into that later?
Why we're passing it into JSONify?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the reason why we pass it into JSONify is to ensure that it's coming back as application/JSON and that it's being rendered as JSON data or interpreted as JSON data. You may get a similar response. So if I, oh, hello. So if I send the request right now, my response is going to look exactly the same. But my headers, it is coming back in application JSON. So my headers currently right now, it's showing me application JSON. What that JSONify function does is it ensures, it's like an extra safety step. It's making sure that whatever data it is that I'm sending back is JSON readable, that it can be interpreted as application JSON. And it's ensuring that this header here for content type is application JSON. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yeah, and from this point on, we need to at least return the student, like anything that pertains to like a dictionary as JSONify. Is that the standard?
If you're returning data to a JavaScript or to JavaScript script, anything that's communicating with the front end, it's going to be in JSON. JSON is the language of the web, right? Most requests, if not all, will be in JSON data. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. Mikhail?
After you install the Thunder client, how do you get that tab to show up?
You'll either have it right here on your left-hand side,
Oh, okay.
or you could press these three dots, and this will open up a little drop-down menu.
Okay, I see it. Thank you.
Of course. Cody?
In your, I think it might be server.py.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have JSONify. Okay. Oh, you have to import JSONify as well.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. That answered my question. Thank you.
Of course. Eric?
So what is the difference between JSONify and Python's JSON.load?
Got it. All right. So the difference between JSONify and Python's JSON.load. So when we receive data in JSON, that's not, as far as Python knows, that's just JSON data, right? It's JavaScript. It doesn't know how to work with it. It needs to be typecasted into a list of dictionaries or a dictionary of strings or integers rather than what comes in from the JavaScript itself. So JSON.loads turns all of our JSON data into Python data structures. It turns it into Python strings, turns it into Python lists, Python dictionaries, X, Y, and Z. That way we can actually work with it with Python. What we're doing here is the opposite. We have Python code and we're turning it or typecasting it into JSON code. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yep, no, that makes sense. Thanks.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here. All right, welcome everyone. Right before we left, we built both of these API right before we left, we built both of these API routes. One of them returning an H1 element for hello X-ray Platoon, and the secondary one returning some JSON data to our browser. I believe our assignment took our abilities to build an API with Flask to the next level. I know everybody was working with lists and dictionaries, and I'm sure that some people were even able to notice that my browser and even Thunder Client are essentially formatting these responses to fall in alphabetical order. So even if your dictionaries or your keys and names are in different order, it's using this as the baseline for A, B, C, and it's organizing your keys in an alphabetical manner. All right. So picking up from where we left off, we have all of our data. We're able to read it from a CSV file. But that's not necessarily what we want, right? We talked about how important it is to have a relational database management system working within our frameworks or our applications. So why is it that we're not using one as of right now? Well, that's what our next portion of our election is going to cover. We're going to be connecting our actual database that we created yesterday to our application. So in a separate server, or in a separate terminal, I apologize, I'm going to go ahead and enter this school DB. And from there, I'm going to select all from students just to make sure they're all still there. All right, so all of my students are still present. They're within the school database. So I know that exists and my objects are present. But how do I make that work with my Python data? Well, let's start off as if this were a class in itself, right? I've mentioned that all of our data tables are going to be referenced to as classes. So let's try to mimic this behavior here, all right? I'm going to go ahead and say that this is where I'm going to start my model, which is going to be my table. And it's going to be a class of students, right? That's what the table is named. The table is named students. So I'm going to mimic that name right up above. All right, this class should have an ID, which we discussed should be an integer. It should have a first name, which we discussed should be interpreted as a string. A last name, again, a string type. We have our age, which is an integer type, and our grade, which is a string type that should only be limited to one character. So here's a quick little outline of what we have here. But how do I turn this class into an actual SQL query or something that can be readable through SQL so that these two things can communicate back and forth? Well, that's going to bring us into our next installment. We're going to install something called Flask-SQLAlchemy. So let's run that command here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that command and put it into X-ray questions. Then I'm going to run it on my terminal. So we're going to run pip install Flask-SQLAlchemy. All right, so we'll see SQLAlchemy is being installed. So that's great. I installed something, but I installed it without even knowing what it is. So let's take a look here. So here's SQLAlchemy. And let me go ahead and move one back here. So here we have Flask SQLAlchemy, and we can see this is the newest version of it. I'll go ahead and share the link to this documentation here on X-ray questions so you guys have it accessible as well. And all SQLAlchemy does is it essentially gives me a way to create classes that will be able to talk to a database, different forms of databases. If I look at their guide, it tells me how to install, how to initialize, how to configure specific extensions, and how to create tables. All right. Let's start looking into how to create tables utilizing Flask SQLAlchemy. So just like before, I have my ID there. But my ID isn't just an integer type. right? This should belong to my students. So I'm missing a way to relate this back into my database. I'm going to run this import statement from Flask-SQLAlchemy, import SQLAlchemy. Again, this is a class that needs to be created, or an instance of it needs to be created. So I'm going to create an instance. I'm going to say, hey, my database will be an instance of SQLAlchemy. Doesn't actually take any parameters that are necessary. Here we can see the app. I can specify an app, or it could be none. And we can see that it's telling me that for all of them, they either have assumed values or they can be nullable values. So I can start it out like this for now. So there's my database. Now this is a class, so I can utilize inheritance to ensure that the student will talk to my database. So I'm going to utilize db.model to specify, hey, this class of student is a model, which is a table. I'm going to write that out. Model is equal to SQL table. And now I'm just going to fill in the blank. Well, if I take a look here, I have all of my types and what I've created before. So rather than it being just an integer, this is a database column. And the type of column that it is a DB integer. And it is a primary key. And I wonder if I spelled that incorrectly. Integer, not integer. All right. So there you go. There's my first portion here. My first name should be a DB column, because this is also a separate column. And this should be a string. Now, yesterday, when we made my SQL query, I remember I made it to 50 characters. And this is the same for last name. So I'm just going to save some time here by copying and pasting some code. So there we go. We got our first name and our last name. This here is an integer type. We've seen an integer column being applied before. Can someone in the class walk me through creating a DB column that is an integer type?
That, oh, is it okay if I do it?
Of course. Let's
Yeah,
hear it.
db.column,
DB.
open brackets, sorry, integer. Oh, not string, the integer.
DB integer. Perfect. So there we have our string types, our integer type, and finally we have our grade. Let's hear from Christopher. Chris, how do I create a string type that will only accept one character?
Say string type that only accept a character. What is it already? Are you reading from a file? It's already a string type, correct?
I'm not going to be reading from a file. I'm actually going to be reading from my database, right? So here I have a string type that is set to 50 characters long. What would it look like if I wanted a string type set to 1 character long?
Oh, so you just do dp dot column and then the parentheses dp string, and I want to say 1.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And there you go. There is my model. This is the same as the database query that I created before. All right, let me go ahead and make a copy of that here. Let me grab the one we did yesterday. So here's what we did yesterday. We created a student with a primary key where the first name was a varchar, the last name was a varchar. We have an integer for age and a grade, which was a character of 1. Well, if we take a look at my model looks exactly the same. I have my ID, which is a primary key, my first name, varchar of 50, last name, varchar of 50, my integer, which is a age, and my grade of a character of 1. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything I've covered so far? Okay, great. If there are no questions, what exactly is it that we want to do here, right? We have our model. Now we can talk to our database to grab all of the contents of this one model. But just like before, I want to isolate this information, right? I don't want it to be necessarily open to anyone or everyone to work with this, or I don't want it living within the same file. Instead, I'm going to grab all of this. I'm going to now take it and place it within models.py. And with that said, I should probably bring in my import statement as well. All right, let's make sure that nothing's broken. Let me try to run my server to make sure everything's still working correctly. All right, it's still able to read from the CSV file as before, so nothing's broken just yet. My server is working just fine. But now how do I connect it? I made this model, but it's not connected just yet, right? It's not actually finding my database and working with it. So how do I make that happen? Well, my model or my SQLAlchemy here, which database, needs an application to work with. And when I provided an application to work with, it's expecting that application to have a path to the correct database. So let's fix our app. Currently, my app does not have a path to that database. So I need to create it. I'm going to do so like this. My app.config is just a dictionary. If I take a look at it here, it takes me to make config. And make config, then you can see it's already trying to run this git debug, and it's coming up with a key. We have our defaults, which is a dictionary for self.default config. All right, and if I take a look at default config, it's not going any further in there, but it's telling me that it's all a dictionary type, right? So inside of my configuration, I want to add a key named SQLAlchemy database URI. Now, this is already named SQLAlchemy, so we know that SQLAlchemy is going to be looking for it. And all I'm specifying to SQLAlchemy is where is it that you can find this database that I want you to talk to. So let's go into that. Right? Where do you find a database that I want you to talk to? Well, we talked a little bit about ports. And we talked a little bit about how to log into our database. But now we're going to create something called a URI. It's going to help me actually be able to interact with my database. So I'm going to say I want to run PSQL, or excuse me, the machine that we're running is going to be PostgreSQL. It's going to be contacted with the username of Francisco Avila. I don't have a password, so I'm not going to include one in there. But if I did have one, it would go in here. And I'm going to do it this way first, and then I'll comment it out and do my actual line, just in case anybody that does have a password here in the class. I'm going to specify the location. Well, the location is going to be at my local host in port 5432. Now, the name of the database that I want you to enter is named school_db. All right, let me copy this over. Let me place that in there and take off that password portion. And then I'm just going to comment this out up above. All right, I'm going to open up the floor for questions here. I see a question from Cody.
Oh, yeah, whenever you said that on line 7 where it says SQLAlchemy, it's squiggled, but that is just a variable that you named, right? because whenever you mentioned that, you said it's looking for SQLAlchemy. So is that a variable inside of that app.config there? Or what, how'd you come up with that SQLAlchemy database URI?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something that I myself just set. I can name this whatever I would like, but it would break it, right? Now, where did I come up with this? If we go through the documentation of Flask, let me see. I can't remember exactly where it's located. I believe it's in configuration keys. Here in configuration keys, it tells me which ones it will need. So here we see SQLAlchemy database URI. So within config, I need to ensure that this is located in there. Otherwise, it won't be able to find the database. So it's something that SQLAlchemy needs. It's not giving it to me specifically. It's not batteries included. It's saying, hey, if you want this to work correctly, you need to make sure that this is inside of your Flask application in the configuration. Does that answer your question, Cody?
It does, yep, thank you.
Of course. Chris?
Yes. So what line 7 is doing is it connecting to that table you made from yesterday, or what is that actually doing for number 7?
What line 7 is doing as of now is it's taking a dictionary, which is config. Config is just a dictionary with different key value pairs. It's creating a new key named SQLAlchemy database URI. And then it's providing a value, which is representing the path to find my database. As of now, it's not connecting to anything. I'm just creating a new key and value pair inside of the dictionary.
Gotcha. But it'll be used to connect to the database later. I guess. Okay.
That's correct. Len?
Yeah, so in the password there, it's just, I'm a weirdo with the password because I want to understand how it worked with this. And so I made a dummy one that's easy to remember. So Spaceballs. Do you just type it in there like straight? It's just like, you just like, not with the brackets, but just straight type it in, or do you use quotes or?
Yeah, if I had a password, it would just be something like hello, if that was my password.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Of course. Brandon?
You said so the 5432 is the port you're connecting to?
Yes.
Is there a reason you just selected 5432 or?
Yes. So if we take a look at PostgreSQL, let's say I quit, and I'm going to purposely cause an error here. So here we get an error, and it's telling me, hey, error connection to server on socket. So that's the port where my PostgreSQL is running. And here it tells me this socket number or the port number is 5432. So that's where PostgreSQL is currently running.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Brandon?
Yeah, are we able to use formatted strings in the app.config? So if we set the key to a formatted string and then, for example, had like a password of some sort set to a variable, could we then pass that in? Does that function in this use case?
It would, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right, Polly?
Going back to the 5432, is there any other way to obtain that number without doing the error method?
I believe you can check it through sudo services. I don't remember the command straight off the top of my head. Let me see here. Let me try this one. And actually, it's not sudo services. It is brew services. I think that will provide it to you as additional information, but I may be wrong. Yeah, I'm wrong. So currently I have Postgres 15, but it's not telling me where it's running. There is a specific command in Linux that you could see all of your background services and what ports they're running in. I just don't know it off the top of my head. I apologize, Polly. I'll get back to you with that.
No problem. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Awesome. So now we got this information. We're able to go into our database. We have a mapping, but we still haven't connected them just yet, right? So now let's go ahead and connect them. I'm going to import my DB. So I'm going to say from models. I want to import both DB and I also want to import students as my table. All right. Now, how exactly do I make SQLAlchemy find this configuration? Well, there's a very specific, Mama, no screaming. I'm so sorry, everyone. There's a specific method that I can utilize here. It's called db.initApp. And that will actually initialize my application to find the configuration. So I'm going to say db.initApp. And then I'm going to pass in the app I would like to initialize. So I'm just going to specify app. I start a Flask server up above. I then add into that Flask server the configuration of SQLAlchemy database URI. I'm telling it, hey, this is where the database is located. We're going to see this in your configuration dictionary. And when I run this init app function, that's where SQLAlchemy grabs the app and says, where's the database located? It looks for the key SQLAlchemy database URI and says, oh, this is the location of the database. Let me connect to it. And then it initializes our application and connects to the correct database. So now let's go ahead and run Python server.py. Okay, and we get an error. This is a good error. All right, it's telling me, hey, you're trying to talk to a database and you're trying to talk to it utilizing Python, but Python and SQL don't really talk together. I need something to work as an interpreter. Well, what we're going to use as a terp is going to be PsychoPG. So the PsychoPG is essentially just that. It works as an interpreter. It turns Python code into SQL queries. And this is how we install it. So it tells me there to run pip install PsychoPG binary. I'm going to share that here on our chat. And I'm going to install that. So I'm going to say pip install PsychoPG binary. And that installed PsychoPG. Okay, good. Well, now that I have PsychoPG, I also have to specify, hey, when you talk to this database here, it's not just a PostgreSQL running. I want you to utilize PsychoPG to speak to it. So now I have PostgreSQL. My database server is a PostgreSQL. I want you to utilize PsychoPG to talk to it. The user you'll be talking to, or the user that you'll be using, will be Francisco Avila. The database is located at localhost port 5432. And the database name is SchoolDB. Let's run our server now. And we'll see that our server runs without any errors. If I come over to 127.0.1, everything is still working correctly. All right. Before I continue moving forward, are there any questions about how to connect PostgreSQL to your app? Go ahead, Chris. You're muted, Chris, if you're talking.
Can you hear me now?
Say again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Cool. So I copy and paste the pip install from Slack into my terminal, and it says no matches found. So
we'll have to do that on a separate chat. That's the command that should be working. If it's not working for you, there's likely a syntax issue going on there.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Go for it, Cody.
Yeah. Actually, mine just says that an SQLAlchemy instance has already been registered. Is that something that we can fix, or I can chat after class also?
We'll definitely have to chat afterwards.
Yep. Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Awesome. I don't see any questions here on the X-ray questions either. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward here. I was able to make my database URI and initialize it to speak to my server. So now let's change our student data here. Rather than grabbing my student data from load CSV, I wonder what happens if I start trying to grab things from the SQL query, right? I want to query the database and grab all of my students. Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to print students. I want to query the database, so I quite literally have to write query. And I want all of them, which is the equivalent of select all from students. Well, I'm going to send this request here. I want this function to get triggered, so I have to go to the endpoint of students. And now we can see a print statement coming up on my terminal here. I'm getting students 1, students 2, students 3, and so on, all the way up to 5. So that is a query set with 5 separate queries inside of them. So now I have all of my query information. I'm actually writing a SQL query that goes into my database and grabs my student data. All right. Let's move forward from there. Now, the student data is here. So let's go ahead and try to change student data for this information. Well, now when I send my request, I get an error. And please don't let this error intimidate you. Usually the very top part tells you everything you need to know. And it tells me, hey, you're trying to send an object of type students, and it's not JSON serializable. Right? So it's telling me, hey, we're trying to JSONify something that you can't turn into JSON data. All right. Well, how do I turn this into JSON data? Can anybody think of something that we know we could do with classes to maybe write a function that will turn this into a JSON object? All right, I'll go ahead and take over here. This is still just OOP, right? We're utilizing a class, so I'm going to add a method. And I'm going to call this to dictionary. And all this method is going to return will be a dictionary where I'll have ID of self.id. I will have first name of self.firstname. I will have age. This is again self.age. And I apologize, I forgot the last name. And then finally, we have grade, which returns self.grade. All right, so there's my toDict method. And it's going to return a dictionary type for each one of these. All right, well, let's try to run my server again. Let's try to refresh it. I still get the same error. Well, I'm not calling my dictionary method, right? So now I made my method toDict. What can I do to grab this list of SQL queries, right? Because if we turn this back into just an empty list of dictionaries and we print student data, well, when I send it, my student data comes up with object instances. So what can I do to turn this list of instances into a list of dictionaries? Go ahead, Cody.
It could create like an str function, like a print. Is that right? Like a repr or something like that?
Close. We created this toDict function that will turn them each into a dictionary. We could try to do a representation function. Right, and now when we send the request, it looks like the representation function doesn't work because that is not a string, right? This should only return a string. So that's not working. What else could we do? Go ahead, Brandon. You're muted if you're speaking.
Could you return student data dot toDict inside the JSONify?
Well, right now when I try to run toDict, it's telling me there's an error. So what is student data, right? What type is that? It's a list. Now the objects inside of it are what hold that method. Go ahead, Eric.
I was gonna say you have to loop through the students and student data and call that method to return that as a dictionary, and then probably send that dictionary as a list into that JSONify function.
All right, so let's try that. Let's try stud.toDict or stud in students.query.all. All right, so now if I send that request, now student data is an actual list of dictionaries, right? I made that toDict method to return a dictionary for each one of them. I am iterating through the list of student instances to then turn them into dictionaries. And then now all I need to do is return student data. And if I refresh the page, we can see I have a list of dictionaries, just like before, being JSONified, but rather than coming in from data.csv, they are coming in straight from my database. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how to query the database and how to serialize our data so that it's JSONifiable rather than getting that JSON object is not serializable? Go ahead, Moa.
Yeah, can you just go through it, quick revision, like in a minute?
Of course.
To remember it, yeah.
So we have this get students function, right? And I want to query my database utilizing student.query.all. That then returns a list of student instances, just like demonstrated here. Now these are class instances, right? So how do I turn them into something that's JSON readable or JSON serializable? Well, I made a method named toDictionary. This method returns a dictionary representation of the student itself. And within the server, I'm utilizing list comprehension to grab each student's dictionary method, the return value of each student's toDict method for every student inside of students.query.all. So I'm iterating through each student and turning them into dictionaries to then return the dictionary as a JSON response. Does that answer your question, Momo? Yeah, I didn't get a read, but I think you said yes. All right, awesome. Any other questions? All right, let's do a quick review over everything we did today. So we started off by building our Flask application. We named it server. From there, we need to add a configuration so that SQLAlchemy can find out where our database is actually located. I am telling it that it will utilize a PostgreSQL engine, and it will speak to it utilizing PsychoPG. I then tell it the user is Francisco Avila, and this database is located at localhost 5432 with the name of SchoolDB. Great. I then go to my DB, which is in my models. It is an instance of SQLAlchemy. It creates a class model, which is the same as an SQL table. I write the representation of the SQL table inside of my model. It matches each one of those fields, as we see here. Let me go ahead and find my select query there. Once we get back all of those tables and we have a representation built out, I then created a method named toDictionary so that it can turn those class instances as a dictionary format. Both of those were imported into my server. And then I take that SQLAlchemy instance and I initiate an app, which is the app that I had above named app. Oh. From there, I created two routes. One, which is my index route, saying say hello. If I go to 127 at port 8000, looks like my app isn't running, which is fair. If I go to 127 at port 8000, we're getting a message, bad request. Interesting. I might have broken something. Let me see if my student still works. Interesting. Looks like I might have broken something in the quick little demo that I was trying to perform here. Oh. Message bad version. I'm not sure what exactly it is that I broke, but I definitely broke something. I apologize, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop that server instance there, and I'll have to figure out what exactly it is that's going on. We know that it's running inside of my app route at index, and it would return a response as such. My get students grabs from the student dictionary and returns a list of dictionaries. It JSONifies it to ensure that it returns a JSON response. And it runs my application at debug with debug equals true on port 8000. Again, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions over any of the material that we covered today? Go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, thanks. What's the difference between line 10 db.init _ app and where you initiated your app to the Flask server?
So
yeah, you in line 10, or sorry, yeah, line 2 there and then line 10 there, yeah. Actually, even line 6 in your server, right? Yeah, line 6 versus line 10. Wait. Oh, no, sorry, you were right. My bad. Yeah, you moved it over to models.
Okay, so this here is making an instance of Flask. It's creating a Flask server. This here is making an instance of SQLAlchemy. Now, this is creating the instance of SQLAlchemy as a class, but it's not initiating an app, meaning it's not connecting to an app to allow it to speak to a database. Here on line 10 is where I tell it, hey, this is the app that you're going to be working with. So utilize the configuration to find a database and work with your tables. Does that answer your question, Cody?
I think so. So in models.py, that one is just. So why do we have that one there?
Because we need DB for SQLAlchemy in order to create our model. Right? We can see we utilize inheritance. And we can see that we're utilizing columns coming from DB and types coming from DB.
And this has to match what we have in our SQL data in our database.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm tracking. Thank you very much.
Of course. Brandon?
So from my understanding, Flask is the framework for the web server, and SQLAlchemy is how we talk to the database that we have.
Right. How Flask communicates with the database. Yes.
Okay. I just needed to understand that to understand the differences between the initialization of Flask and then the initialization. Okay.
Awesome.
Also, I'm looking in the notes and there's a __ name for initialization. Why would you do that instead of what you've done here where you're initializing Flask to server?
You're referencing to this?
Yes. And I believe in when you initialize Flask, it initializes to name instead of server.
All right. So I apologize, everyone. I'm having some chewing issues apparently. All right. So name is a Python like global variable that stands for whatever script is calling this. All right. So if I was calling this script from models, or let's say I had a runner.py and I was calling server, importing something from server into that runner, then name would be defaulted to runner. And this is additional information. If this is by any means confusing or concerning to anybody, please just data dump what I'm talking here. So this is going to be referencing whichever module is being executed and is asking for information from this script. That's what name is, right? Main means which one is actually being executed. So if I were running from runner, the name here would be runner.py, but main, I could have a main.py or something else, and that's not necessarily what's being triggered, right? What this is doing is it's making sure, hey, we should only be running the server when this script is the one that's being executed. So when I type in Python server.py and I run that in my terminal, both of these, name and main, will be equal to server.py. And that's why it runs the server. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But so what did you say it correlates to initializing Flask to name?
Oh, so in this portion, if you just want to name it name, then it would just adopt the name of the file, which is server.py.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Oh, that might be why it didn't run, because server is misspelled.
Oh, you think so? Let me try.
In your Python file, yeah.
No, it's something else going on.
Oh, okay.
Go for it, Rojan.
Could you explain again how you get the query all in the student data?
How did I get the query.all?
Yeah, the student dot query dot all, that one.
Yeah, so if I come back over here to my Flask-Alchemy and I scroll down to modifying and querying data, here we see queries for views. And if you read through this, it tells you how to write different queries. There's quite a bit. It tells you how to run select statements. I can't find the exact location off the top of my head, unfortunately. But I know that that's the syntax. So when I'm calling the class that I'm utilizing, I am running a query, and then I could either run all, or I could run filter and then pass in a condition in which I wanted to filter by. So I could say like, hey, I want students first name, where they're equal to John, right? And it would only return the ones equal to John. It's kind of how you run your where statement.
Okay. So how did that connect to the utilities where you loaded the data?
It doesn't connect to the utilities anymore. We got rid of that.
Okay. So could your error be because you still importing the utilities from the top and the load data?
I doubt it, but we could try it. Yeah, that's not it. It's something that has to do with this line of code right here, I'm pretty sure. But I'll figure it out and send it out to everybody. Oh,
I
go.
think it's misspelled in your command, your terminal command.
Misspelled in my terminal command. What's misspelled in my terminal command?
Like if you try to run it again, like Python.
Yeah, I could name it server and then run python server.py, but that's not the issue.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Go ahead, Momo.
Can you please explain again one more time the if name equal main? I didn't get that one.
That's gonna be additional information. We could meet afterwards. I just want to make sure that I don't lose the rest of the class trying to cover that. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.